Welcome back to Divine Light. Today we are doing something different. We are not watching an empire fall from the outside. We are standing inside the city as it happens. Every chapter we have studied so far has given us the view from above. The long arc of Babylon, the merchant collapse of Moab, the night the walls of Carthage burned. But Isaiah 22 pulls the camera inward. The prophet turns away from the horizon and looks directly at Jerusalem itself. And what he sees disturbs him more deeply than anything he witnessed in the falling empires around it. He calls this chapter the Oracle of the Valley of Vision. And that title alone is a paradox worth sitting with before we read a single verse. Jerusalem is a city built on hills. Every traveller who has ever approached it from the desert has described the same overwhelming sight. The walls rising from the rock, the towers catching the morning light, the sense of a city that was built to be seen from a great distance. It is not a valley. It has never been a valley. So why does the prophet call it one? Because Isaiah is not describing the geography, he is describing the spiritual condition. When a city loses its inner vision, its living connection to the divine purpose for which it was built, it doesn't matter how high its walls stand. It has already sunk into a valley. The heights are held by the enemy, the light comes from outside, and the people on the rooftops are no longer prophets scanning the horizon for divine instruction. They are spectators watching their own destruction approach. This is the oracle of the Valley of Vision. And it is the most personal prophecy Isaiah has ever delivered. Before we enter verse by verse, we need to understand what this chapter is doing inside the larger structure of Isaiah's prophecies. Starting in chapter 13, Isaiah has been moving around the ancient horizon like a historian cataloguing every ecosystem in a dying world. Babylon, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Egypt. One by one, the great civilizations of the ancient Near East come under the same prophetic examination. Each one rises on a foundation of pride. Each one collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. And each one leaves behind the same ecological signature: the dried springs, the empty palaces, the wild things reclaiming the ruins. But here in chapter 22, Isaiah stops his tour of the surrounding nations and turns to face his own city. The burden he now carries is not for a foreign empire. It is for Jerusalem, and the grief in his voice is unmistakable. This prophecy has a cycle. From the time of King Hezekiah through the Babylonian exile, the Persian return, the Hellenistic period, the Roman conquest, the Byzantine era, the Sassanid siege, the Arab conquest, the Crusader kingdom, the Mamluk period, the Ottoman centuries, and finally the British Mandate, the city has passed from hand to hand approximately a dozen times. And each transition has followed the same detailed internal pattern: a period of false security, a sudden realization that the surrounding heights have been lost, a frantic crowding onto the rooftops, a collapse of the internal administration, and then the birth of a new era under a new steward. Today, we are going to trace that cycle through two specific historical moments: the Fatimid Crusader transition of 1099 and the Ottoman Exit of 1917. 8 centuries apart, same pattern, same verses, same city. Let us begin.
The oracle concerning the Valley of Vision. What is the matter with you now, that you have all gone up to the rooftops?
The first image Isaiah gives us is not armies. It is not fire. It is not a breach in the wall. It is people climbing to their rooftops. In the ancient world, the roof was the platform of the prophet. When a watchman wanted to scan the horizon for divine signals, he climbed. When a seer wanted to receive a vision, he went up. The rooftop was the interface between the human and the divine. But Isaiah looks at these people on the rooftops, and his first response is not admiration. It is a question. What is the matter with you? Why are you up there? Because these people are not prophets. They are spectators. They have climbed to the rooftops, not to receive a vision, but to watch a spectacle. The enemy is approaching. The world is shifting. And instead of descending into the interior silence where genuine perception lives, they have gone up to get a better view of their own collapse. This is the fundamental spiritual diagnosis of the chapter. The city has the architecture of vision, the heights, the hills, the physical elevation. But it has lost the inner connection that makes those heights meaningful. It has become a valley wearing the shape of a mountain. In the summer of 1099, the Crusader army appeared on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. The Fatimid garrison defending the city was a diverse professional force: Sudanese archers from the Nile Valley, Arab cavalry, Berber mercenaries, and local militias. Their commander, Iftikhar al-Dawla, was an experienced administrator who had spent months preparing the city's physical defences. He had poisoned the wells outside the walls. He had sealed the cisterns. He had expelled the Eastern Christian population, fearing collaboration with the approaching Franks. And when the Crusaders arrived and began their preparations, the defenders of Jerusalem crowded onto the walls and rooftops of the Tower of David and the northern battlements to watch. They watched the Genoese sailors dismantle their ships piece by piece and haul the timber up the slopes of the surrounding hills to build massive siege towers. They observed every movement of the enemy with careful physical attention. But they were watching from a valley. The spiritual vision of the city had already been evacuated along with the Eastern Christian communities that Iftikhar had expelled. The rooftops were full. The vision was empty. 8 centuries later, in the autumn of 1917, the population of Jerusalem crowded onto the flat roofs of the old city for a different but remarkably similar reason. The Ottoman Yildirim army group, supported by German officers and artillery, was visibly preparing for a retreat. Eyewitnesses recorded how ordinary residents climbed to their rooftops to watch the frantic movement of troops and equipment through the narrow streets below. They were looking outward, searching for human signals, watching for the arrival of the British forces under General Allenby, scanning the horizon for any sign of who would arrive next to take possession of the city. The rooftops of 1917 were as full as the rooftops of 1099, and in both cases the people on them were spectators rather than visionaries. They were watching history happen to them rather than participating in the deeper current of what the city was always meant to be.
You who are full of noise, a tumultuous city, a joyous town. Your dead are not killed with the sword, nor did they die in battle.
Isaiah now describes the interior soundscape of the fallen city. And the sound is not weeping, it is noise. There are 3 layers to this noise, and they represent a progression of spiritual decay. The first is the sound of confusion, the aimless running of people who have no center. When there is no vision, there is only motion. People moving without direction, speaking without meaning, acting without purpose. The second layer is the sound of overcrowding. The city has been flooded with refugees from the surrounding regions. Every wave of collapse in the territories around Jerusalem drives another surge of displaced people through the gates. They bring their anxiety with them. They bring their survival instincts and their shattered expectations. The city is noisy not with life, but with the compressed terror of people who have nowhere else to go. And the third layer is the most disturbing. It is joy. A manic, desperate, performative joy. The eat and drink for tomorrow we die energy that surfaces whenever a population has decided, consciously or not, that the situation is beyond remedy. They celebrate temporary reprieves as if they were permanent victories. They use revelry to paper over the fact that the walls are cracking and the leadership has already made its private arrangements for escape. And then Isaiah says something that stops the reader cold. Your dead are not killed with the sword, nor did they die in battle. The city is full of the dying, but they are not dying from enemy weapons. They are dying from terror. Their hearts are failing before the first arrow is fired. The spirit leaves the body before the sword touches it. They have been conquered internally while the walls still stand. In the weeks before the Crusader Breach of Jerusalem, the streets were packed with thousands of Muslim and Jewish refugees from the coastal towns. The city that was supposed to be the stronghold of Fatimid power had become a compressed vessel of collective fear. The noise was real, the manic quality of the atmosphere was real, and the dead who did not die from the sword were real as well. The overcrowding, the disease, the breakdown of supply lines, all producing a death toll before the walls were ever breached. In 1917, the pattern repeated with modern precision. German officers held elaborate banquets at the Hotel Fast in Jerusalem, maintaining a facade of imperial confidence even as British artillery boomed from the surrounding hills. The Ottoman administration organized official religious calls for a holy defense of the city, while the population was too hungry and diseased to respond. Typhus and cholera were moving through the Jewish and Arab quarters. The Jewish community of Jerusalem, which had already been devastated by Ottoman deportations and famine during the war years, was dying in the streets, not from enemy fire, but from the institutional collapse of the regime that was supposed to protect them. The noise of the city in those final weeks was the noise of a system pretending to function while already hollow at its core.
All your leaders fled together. They were captured without the bow. All of you who were found were captured together, though they had fled from far away.
Here the camera shifts from the general population to the leadership. And what the prophet sees there is the defining image of institutional failure. The leaders flee first, not last, together. In any functioning military or civic structure, the leadership is supposed to be the last to leave. The captain stays on the deck. The officer holds the line while the civilians escape. But Isaiah describes something different. The leaders are the first to abandon the city, and they flee not individually, but together, as a group, as if they had conspired in advance to leave. And the cruelest detail is this: they are captured without the bow. The enemy doesn't even need to fight them. The mere existence of the approaching judgment is enough to bind them. Their own fear has imprisoned them before a single physical chain has been applied. When the Crusader siege towers finally reached the northern wall of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, the Fatimid leadership did not organize a final defense of the streets. Iftikhar al-Dawla and his inner circle retreated immediately to the Tower of David and sealed themselves inside. While the population was massacred in the streets below, the governor negotiated his personal safe conduct. He walked out of the city alive, escorted by a Crusader honor guard, while behind him the city burned. He was captured without the bow, not in chains, not in battle, but by his own calculation, which had reduced him from a defender to a negotiator of his own survival. On the night of December 8, 1917, the Ottoman High Command, including the governor Izzet Pasha and the German military staff, fled Jerusalem together under cover of darkness. They did not organize a final stand. They did not hold the line until morning. They evacuated the city in the night, moving toward Jericho in a retreat so rapid that they left behind military equipment, administrative records, and the civilian population they were responsible for protecting. The Ottoman ranks were filled with conscripts who had been brought from Anatolia and Iraq, men who had fled from far only to find themselves abandoned in the collapsing front of a city their commanders had already decided to surrender. Like the Fatimid leadership 8 centuries before them, they were captured without the bow, bound not by enemy chains, but by the momentum of their own institutional collapse.
So I said, "Look away from me. Let me weep bitterly. Do not try to comfort me over the destruction of the daughter of my people."
At this point in the prophecy, Isaiah does something unexpected. He stops speaking as a judge and begins speaking as a witness. He asks to be left alone with his grief. The people are on the rooftops looking outward at the spectacle of their own collapse, and the prophet descends. He goes down into his own interior valley to grieve what he sees. He cannot be comforted by human words because the desolation he is witnessing is not a political problem with a political solution. It is a spiritual catastrophe. The daughter of his people, the living, breathing community of Jerusalem, the ordinary people whose lives are the actual fabric of the city, is being consumed by the failure of the leaders above them and the enemies surrounding them. There is a figure hidden in this verse that runs like a thread through every major transition in Jerusalem's history. The prophet calls them the remnant that does not flee. The people who have no safe conduct to negotiate, no private arrangement with the incoming power, no horse waiting at a side gate, they are the ones who stay, and they bear the full weight of every transition. In 1099, the Jewish community of Jerusalem found themselves in exactly this position. While the Fatimid garrison retreated to the Tower of David and the Muslim population sought shelter in the mosques, the Jewish community retreated to their central synagogue. When the Crusaders broke through and began moving through the city, the synagogue was set on fire. The community inside sang Shema Yisrael as the flames rose. They were the daughter of the people, the ones who had nowhere to flee, no imperial affiliation to protect them, no negotiated exit. They stayed because it was their city, in a way it had never truly been the Fatimid garrison's city, and they bore the full cost of a transition between 2 regimes, neither of which had any interest in protecting them. In 1917, the Jewish population of Jerusalem had endured 4 years of Ottoman wartime rule that included mass deportations, confiscations of property, forced labor, and the threat of the same fate that had befallen the Armenian community. By the time the British arrived, the Jewish quarter was devastated by famine and disease. These were Isaiah's daughter of the people, the fixed point, the nail in the wall, the community that had nowhere to go, and therefore stayed through every transition, bearing the grief that the prophet could not ask anyone to comfort him about, because it was simply too deep for human words to reach.
For the Lord God of hosts has a day of panic, trampling, and confusion in the valley of vision, a breaking down of walls and a crying to the mountain.
Now the day itself arrives, and Isaiah describes it in 3 rapid Hebrew words that build like a drumbeat: panic, trampling, confusion. First comes the panic. The moment when the psychological structure collapses and the crowd loses its ability to think collectively. Then comes the trampling, the physical reality of thousands of people moving through narrow streets without coordination, the human body becoming an instrument of destruction against other human bodies. And finally comes the confusion, the total mental bewilderment when the system a person has trusted completely reveals itself to be hollow. The walls break down. And then, in one of the most haunting images in the entire chapter, the people cry out to the mountains. Not to God, to the mountains, to the enemy-held heights that now surround them. Because when the walls are gone, the mountains are where the power is, and the people in the valley look up and cry toward the force that has conquered the high ground. July 15th, 1099. The siege tower, built from Genoese ship timber, finally made contact with the northern wall of Jerusalem. The Crusader knight Godfrey of Bouillon led the crossing. Within hours the city was open. The day of panic arrived exactly as Isaiah described it. First the psychological collapse of the garrison, then the trampling in the narrow streets as thousands of people tried simultaneously to find sanctuary, and finally the total confusion of a population that could not process the speed of the disintegration. Survivors crying out to the heights, literally calling up toward the Crusader forces now controlling the walls, begging for a mercy that in many cases did not come. In December 1917, the day arrived differently, but carried the same signature. On the morning of December 9th, the mayor of Jerusalem, Hussein al-Husseini, walked out of the Jaffa Gate carrying a white flag. He had been searching for a British officer to receive the city's surrender since early morning, wandering through the surrounding hills because the Ottoman administration had already fled, and the British vanguard had not yet arrived in force. The walls, not the physical stones of Suleiman's magnificent fortifications, but the administrative and military walls of 4 centuries of Ottoman sovereignty, had broken down overnight without a single shot being fired against them. And the mayor of the city was literally crying to the mountain, walking up into the hills surrounding Jerusalem, looking for the new power to surrender to, because the old power had vanished in the night.
Elam carried the quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Ker uncovered the shield.
Isaiah now shifts to the military picture. The forces arrayed against the city are diverse and multinational. Elam, a nation of archers, the special forces of the ancient world, is bringing its quivers. Ker is uncovering its shields, the ancient signal that battle is imminent. The flash of polished bronze shields in the sun was a psychological weapon, as much as a physical one. A wall of reflected light designed to break the resolve of defenders before the first arrow was loosed. What this verse is describing is the moment when the city realizes that the force coming against it is not a local skirmish, but a convergence of distant powers. The archers are not neighbors. The chariots are not familiar. This is a coalition assembled from the far edges of the known world, and it has arrived at the gates. The Fatimid defense of 1099 relied on exactly the kind of multinational force that Elam and Kir represent. Sudanese archers who had travelled from the Upper Nile, Berber cavalry from North Africa, Turkic mercenaries from the eastern steppes. The governor Iftikhar al-Dawla had assembled a cosmopolitan garrison in the hope that professional diversity would compensate for the loss of the spiritual coherence that had once made the city defensible from within. When the Crusader siege towers moved into position, the uncovering of the shield, the revelation that the enemy's preparations were complete and the breach was imminent, produced exactly the psychological effect Isaiah describes. The garrison saw the towers, they saw the scale of the preparation, and the confidence that their walls had generated evaporated. In 1917, the modern Elam was the long-range artillery of the German Asia Corps, weapons that could reach the city from distances that would have seemed supernatural to any previous generation of defenders. And the uncovering of the British shield was the arrival of the Australian Light Horse, a cavalry force that moved with a speed and geographic range that the Ottoman garrison simply could not counter. When the reports arrived that Beersheba had fallen, that the desert flank had been turned, that the cavalry was moving faster than the supply lines could support a retreat, that was the moment the shield was uncovered. The garrison saw the full shape of what was coming and knew the walls could not hold it.
And it happened that your choicest valleys were full of chariots, and the horsemen took their positions at the gate.
The valleys surrounding Jerusalem are specific: the Kidron to the east, the Hinnom to the south, and west. These are the natural moats that give the city its defensive geography. As long as these valleys are controlled by the defenders, the city has breathing room. Once they fill with enemy forces, the city is a trapped animal. Surrounded on every side, the gates strangled, the commerce dead, the heartbeat of the city silenced. Isaiah describes the horsemen taking their positions at the gate. In the ancient world, the gate was everything. It was where trade happened, where disputes were adjudicated, where the social life of the city had its physical center. To have the enemy positioned at the gate was not merely a military fact. It was a statement about who now controlled the meaning of the city. In July 1099, the valleys around Jerusalem filled with the Crusader encampment. The choicest valleys, the natural approaches to the walls, were occupied by the forces of Godfrey of Bouillon to the north, Raymond of Toulouse to the south, and the Genoese fleet's contribution positioned at the western approach. The city was completely encircled. The gate, the commercial and social lifeblood of Jerusalem, was choked. And on the day the walls were breached, the horsemen flooded through the Lion's Gate into the city, taking possession of the space that had defined Jerusalem's public life for generations. In 1917, the valleys filled with a different kind of chariot. The mechanized units of the British Expeditionary Force moved through the Judean hills with a speed that ancient armies could not have imagined. And General Allenby's decision to approach the Jaffa Gate on foot, deliberately dismounting from his horse in a direct rebuke to the Kaiser's famous mounted entry through a specially breached wall in 1898, was a conscious act of positioning himself at the gate as a servant rather than a conqueror. The gate changed hands. The valleys were full, and the new era had begun its entrance.
He removed the protection of Judah, and in that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest.
Here Isaiah identifies the precise moment of spiritual exposure. The protection of Judah, the divine covering that had made the city more than merely a fortress, is removed. And in that exact moment, the people turned to the weapons of the house of the forest. Solomon had built a magnificent structure of cedar pillars that served as the great armory of Jerusalem. It was called the House of the Forest of Lebanon because its rows of cedar columns made it look like standing inside a grove of trees. It was beautiful, it was impressive, and it was filled with weapons. The spiritual diagnosis Isaiah is making here is precise and devastating. When the divine covering is withdrawn, the people do not turn inward to examine why it was withdrawn. They turn outward to count their weapons. They inventory their shields and spears. They calculate their military capacity. They do everything except ask the one question that might actually save them. Why has the protection been removed, and what would it take to restore it? The Fatimid garrison in 1099 exemplifies this perfectly. The governor seized the assets of religious institutions to pay his mercenaries. He turned the city's spiritual spaces into military logistics centers. The House of the Forest became the Tower of David, the final armory, the last stronghold, and everyone's attention focused there. The divine covering had been removed, and the response was to polish the weapons rather than examine the soul. In 1917, the Ottomans turned the sacred landmarks of Jerusalem into fortified positions. The Notre Dame de France became an armory. The Austrian hospice became a command post. Ancient religious buildings were stripped of their wooden fixtures to provide fuel for military trains. The beautiful House of the Forest, the historic and spiritual architecture of the city, was unmasked as nothing more than a source of building material for a collapsing defense. By the time the British arrived, the armories were empty, the weapons were abandoned in the retreat, and the House of the Forest had given everything it had to a cause that was already lost.
You saw that the breaches in the city of David were many, and you collected the waters of the lower pool.
A shift happens in this verse that is easy to miss. the prophet moves from the word vision to the word sight. The people are no longer prophets looking for divine signals. They are engineers inspecting physical damage. They saw the breaches. They surveyed the cracks in the walls. They mapped the vulnerabilities in the fortifications. And then they collected the waters of the lower pool. They began preparing for a siege, storing the physical resource that biological survival depends on. There is nothing wrong with inspecting walls or collecting water. These are prudent things. But the prophet's point is about sequence and priority. The people have moved from a posture of spiritual openness, looking upward for vision, to a posture of physical anxiety, looking downward for cracks. They have traded the upper pool for the lower pool, the higher source for the material reserve. Iftikhar al-Dawlah's entire defensive strategy was built on this verse. He mapped every breach, reinforced every vulnerable section of wall, poisoned the external water sources, and concentrated the city's internal water supply within the walls. He was a master of the physics of the siege, and his mastery produced a garrison that was physically prepared and spiritually hollow, a city that had traded its vision for its reservoirs. The Ottoman engineers of 1917 conducted the same inventory with modern precision. German military cartographers mapped every defensive weakness in the Jerusalem perimeter. The water infrastructure from the ancient pools of Solomon was modernized and brought inside the defensive perimeter. The Birket Sultan, the old lower pool, was incorporated into the military water supply. Every crack in the physical defense was catalogued and addressed, and the spiritual crack, the loss of any genuine mandate to hold the city, the absence of any vision for what the city was supposed to be under their stewardship, went unexamined until the morning they fled.
You counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall.
This is the cannibalization of the city. The government counts the houses, cold, bureaucratic, inventory thinking, and then begins dismantling them. The walls need reinforcement. The houses provide material. The logic is military, and it is unassailable on its own terms. But the prophet sees it for what it is, a civilization consuming itself. The wall is supposed to protect the houses. The moment you begin destroying houses to protect the wall, you have inverted the entire purpose of the defense. You are preserving the container by destroying what it was meant to contain. In the final weeks of the Fatimid defense of 1099, structures near the northern wall were dismantled and their materials used to reinforce the battlements. The stone of ordinary people's homes, the physical expression of their lives, their families, their daily existence, was repurposed for the physics of a defense that would fail anyway. The daughter of the people was consumed by the apparatus that was supposed to protect her. In 1917, the Ottoman requisitions were the modern version of the same act. Turkish and German officers moved through the Jewish and Arab quarters of the city, counting, literally inventorying, every sack of grain, every piece of lumber, every scrap of metal that could serve the military. Wood was stripped from homes to fuel military trains. Food was seized from families already on the edge of starvation. The houses of Jerusalem were being broken down to fortify a wall that would not be defended, and the people whose houses were being consumed had no recourse, no protection, and no voice in the decision.
You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to its maker, nor did you respect the one who planned it long ago.
This is the pivot point of the entire chapter. Everything before this verse has been description. The rooftops, the noise, the fleeing leaders, the broken walls, the counted houses. But here, Isaiah delivers the diagnosis. You built a reservoir between the two walls. You engineered a closed system. You created a self-sustaining loop of physical preparation, and it was technically brilliant. The reservoir between the two walls, protected from outside attack, fed from the ancient pool providing water for a long siege, represents the absolute peak of human engineering applied to the problem of survival. But you did not look to its maker. That is the entire indictment. Not that the engineering was wrong, not that the water was contaminated, not that the walls were insufficient. The indictment is that in all the counting and breaking and collecting and reservoiring, nobody stopped to look at the one who designed the city in the first place. Nobody consulted the ancient blueprint. Nobody asked what the city was actually for. And the phrase that follows is devastating in its precision. Nor did you respect the one who planned it long ago. The city of Jerusalem was not an accident of geography. It was not chosen because of its water supply or its defensive position. It was planned from a distance of time that human calculation cannot reach, as a specific place where the human and divine were intended to meet. And the people preparing their siege reservoirs had completely forgotten this. They were optimizing a vessel whose purpose they had abandoned. Iftikhar al-Dawla was, by any military standard, a competent commander. His water strategy was sophisticated, his garrison was professional, his defensive preparations were thorough. But he did not look to the maker of the city. He looked to Cairo. He looked to his mercenaries. He looked to his walls. And on the morning the walls were breached, everything he had built, every reservoir, every reinforced battlement, every poisoned well, proved insufficient because the foundation it was built on had already been withdrawn. The German engineers who modernized Jerusalem's water infrastructure in 1917 were among the finest military engineers in the world. They upgraded the pipe systems, improved the telegraph network, mapped the defensive perimeter with precision instruments. They had complete regard for the physics of the city. They had no regard for its vision. And on the morning of December the 9th, the city slipped through their technically sophisticated fingers as if it had never been theirs, because in the deepest sense it never had been.
In that day, the Lord God of hosts called for weeping and mourning, for shaving your heads and wearing sackcloth.
In the middle of the military catastrophe, God opens a door. The day of panic, the trampling, the confusion, the breach in the wall, is not only a judgment, it is an invitation. The crisis is designed to create the conditions for a spiritual pivot. The call to weep and mourn is not a call to despair. It is a call to stop, to put down the weapons inventory, to step away from the reservoir, to sit in silence with the reality of what has happened and ask the question that has not been asked. Why has the covering been removed? The shaving of the head and the wearing of sackcloth are not punishments. They are voluntary acts of stripping, the willingness to remove the external coverings of status and defense and stand naked before the truth. You cannot receive a new vision while still wearing the armor of the old one. In the final days before the Crusader Breach of 1099, there were calls for prayer in the mosques of Jerusalem. There were moments of genuine communal grief, but for the ruling elite, the governor and his guard, safely behind the walls of the Tower of David, the call for weeping arrived too late and was answered too shallowly. The mourning happened after the massacre, when the refugees who escaped to Damascus and Baghdad finally processed what had been lost. The door was opened in the middle of the crisis. It was not walked through until after the city was gone. In 1917, the official religious leadership of the Ottoman administration issued calls for a holy defense of the city. This was the external form of the call for sackcloth. But the contrast between the official proclamations and the reality of the streets was so vast as to be almost grotesque. German officers were holding dinner parties at the Hotel Fast, while the Jewish population was dying of hunger 2 streets away. The call for weeping was issued. The weeping was real, but it came from the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, and the leadership that should have heard it was already planning its midnight exit.
Instead, there is joy and gladness, killing cattle and slaughtering sheep, eating meat and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die.
This is the direct rejection of verse 12. God opens the door to genuine mourning and transformation, and the response is a feast. Isaiah is not describing ordinary celebration. He is describing a specific psychological phenomenon that appears at the end of every civilization that has chosen physics over vision. It is the feast of the condemned, the manic consumption of resources that should be preserved, the slaughter of the animals that could sustain a long siege, eaten in a single night of nihilistic revelry, the explicit acknowledgement, for tomorrow we die, that the situation is hopeless, combined with the deliberate choice to respond to that hopelessness not with repentance, but with consumption. This is the moment when a civilization eats its own future. The ruling Fatimid elite in the final days of July 1099 maintained their personal comforts inside the Tower of David, even as the siege towers moved closer. The governor and his guard had already negotiated their exit. They were, in the most literal sense, eating and drinking while the city burned, consuming the resources of a situation they had privately decided to abandon while publicly maintaining the performance of resistance. The cattle and sheep of the city's emergency reserves were being consumed by the people who had already arranged their own survival. At the Hotel Fast in Jerusalem in 1917, German and Ottoman officers held elaborate dinners as British artillery grew audible in the distance. The menu at these final banquets was reportedly lavish. The wine was poured. The conversation was conducted in the tones of men maintaining their dignity in the face of what they privately knew was inevitable. 2 streets away, in the Jewish quarter, families were dividing whatever food remained among the children first. The feast of the condemned and the fast of the faithful were happening simultaneously, separated by the width of a Jerusalem alley. For tomorrow we die. It is the most honest thing the condemned ever say. And it is the thing they say instead of the one question that might actually change tomorrow.
The Lord of hosts revealed this in my hearing. Surely this sin will never be forgiven you until the day you die, says the Lord God of hosts.
The door has closed. Isaiah hears the verdict not once but twice. The Lord of hosts appears at the beginning of this verse and at the end. A double seal, a double hearing. The first mention is the revelation of the judgment to the prophet. The second is the judicial stamp of finality. The administration that responded to crisis with feasting rather than mourning, that chose the physics of self-preservation over the vision of genuine return, has passed the point of no return. The forgiveness that is withheld here is not the eternal forgiveness of individual souls. It is the forgiveness of the current administration, the preservation of the existing regime. The decree is institutional. This era is over. The stewardship has failed, and no amount of last-minute piety will repair what has been broken, because the window for repair has passed. The Fatimid era in Jerusalem ended in the fires of July 1099. They never returned. The political structure that had governed the city was not damaged or weakened. It was eliminated. The governor walked out alive, but the governance died completely. The iniquity of choosing personal safety over the daughter of the people was sealed by the verdict of history with the same finality that Isaiah describes. The Ottoman era ended on December 9, 1917. 400 years of caliphate authority over the city evaporated in a single morning. The mayor walked out with a white flag. The high commander had fled in the night. And the decree was sealed, not with violence, not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet finality of a morning when a new era simply arrived and the old one was simply gone. The double hearing of Isaiah's verse found its historical echo in the double headline of that December. The Ottoman departure and the British arrival announced simultaneously, the old era and the new era pronounced in the same breath. Now we arrive at the center of the prophecy, the figure of Shebna.
Thus says the Lord God of hosts. Go, proceed to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the house, and say,
The prophet is commanded to leave the general population and confront a specific individual. Shebna is the chief steward, the prime administrator, the man who controls the city's resources and manages the physical apparatus of the government. He is the one who oversaw the wall inspections, organized the reservoir construction, managed the military logistics. He is, in every technical sense, the competent professional running the system. But God refers to him with the word this, not Shebna my steward, not Shebna the administrator, this Shebna. The demonstrative is a term of distance, almost of contempt. It signals that the man who occupies the highest administrative position in the city has become, in the divine accounting, merely an object, a mechanism, a cog in a failing machine who has confused his function for his identity. The Shebna figure is not a villain in the ordinary sense. He is not plotting evil. He is doing his job with considerable skill and dedication. But his job has become his God. The city exists in his mind to be administered. The walls exist to be maintained. The reservoirs exist to be filled. And the purpose behind all of this, the vision that makes the administration meaningful, has been entirely lost to him. In 1099, the Shebna of Jerusalem was Iftikhar al-Dawla. He was over the house in the most literal sense, the military governor responsible for the physical integrity of the city. His administrative competence was genuine. His personal courage was real. But he was a steward without a vision, managing a city he did not truly belong to for a caliphate in Cairo that could not reach him. He was the prime minister of a system that had already been spiritually vacated. In 1917, the Shebna figure was not a single individual, but the collective Ottoman-German High Command. Izzet Pasha, the local governor, and the German officers who provided the technical expertise. Together they were over the house. Together they had managed the physics of the city's defense with considerable professionalism. And together they fled in the night, leaving the house they had administered to face the morning without them.
What are you doing here, and who do you have here, that you have carved out a tomb for yourself here? He carves his tomb on the heights. He cuts a resting place for himself in the rock.
God's challenge to Shebna contains a question that cuts straight to the root of the problem. Who do you have here? It is a question about belonging, about lineage, about the difference between occupying a city and being of a city. Shebna has no ancestral roots in Jerusalem. He is a steward placed by an imperial administration to manage an asset. And in his heart, perhaps without even being fully conscious of it, he knows this. Which is why he is doing the thing that all administrators without genuine belonging eventually do. He is carving his tomb into the rock of the heights of Jerusalem. The tomb is the ultimate act of manufactured permanence. Unable to establish a genuine historical connection to the city through lineage or vision, Shebna is trying to establish one through stone. He is carving his name into the geology of Jerusalem. He is investing not in the living vision of the city, but in the monument to his own eventual death. As if the rock will remember him when the people have forgotten him, as if the permanence of stone can substitute for the permanence of purpose, and this detail, the administrator carving his tomb into the heights of the city he is about to lose, turns out to be one of the most consistently repeated details in the entire cycle of Jerusalem's transitions. In the valley of Silwan, overlooking the Kidron, archaeologists discovered a rock-cut tomb from the late 8th century bearing a Paleo-Hebrew inscription that scholars believe refers to this very Shebna. The physical evidence of an administrator trying to carve himself into the permanent memory of Jerusalem survives to this day. But it doesn't stop there. Before the Great Revolt of 70 CE, the royal family of Adiabene built the massive rock-hewn Tomb of the Kings in northern Jerusalem. Monuments of death used as final strongholds as the city burned. The Byzantine governors focused their last spiritual and military energies on the rock-cut Holy Sepulchre when the Sassanid Persians approached. The Crusader kings literally hewed their tombs into the rock at the entrance of the Holy Sepulchre. Men like Baldwin V buried in the carved stone, their physical presence in the rock intended to establish a permanent claim that evaporated when Saladin surrounded the city. The Mamluk governors built elaborate funerary madrasas along the heights overlooking the Temple Mount, massive stone monuments to their own legacy that were simply repurposed or ignored when the next era arrived. And finally, in 1917, the German administration built the Augusta Victoria Foundation on the Mount of Olives, with its massive bell tower and stone-hewn halls designed to be the permanent expression of German imperial presence in the Holy City, a tomb on the heights if there ever was one. General von Falkenhayn used it as his final headquarters, and on the morning of the British arrival, it became the place where the new administration established its first foothold. Every Shebna carves his tomb on the heights. Every tomb becomes a headquarters for the next administration, and every administration eventually learns, or fails to learn, the same lesson about the difference between carving yourself into the rock and being called by the Maker.
Look, the Lord will hurl you away violently, you mighty man. He will seize firm hold on you and whirl you around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. There you shall die, and there shall be your splendid chariots, you shame of your master's house. I will thrust you from your office, and you will be pulled down from your station.
The ball metaphor is one of the most vivid images in all of Isaiah. A ball has no inherent stability. Once thrown with force, it travels entirely at the mercy of the thrower, with no control over its own direction, no ability to stop itself, no choice about where it lands. The momentum is not its own. This is the fate of the administrator who tried to carve himself into the rock. He wanted permanence. He gets trajectory. He wanted a tomb on the heights. He gets a rolling journey into a wide land far from the city whose rock he tried to claim. The wide land is not just a geographical destination, it is the antithesis of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the specific, the chosen, the named, the purposeful. The wide land is the general, the vast, the undifferentiated, the spiritually uncentered. For the man who based his entire identity on his position in the city, exile to the wide land is the ultimate punishment, because it removes the one thing that gave his life its apparent meaning. Iftikhar al-Dawla was thrown from Jerusalem like a ball. He walked out of the Tower of David alive and returned to Egypt, where he spent the rest of his life far from the city he had governed. His splendid chariots, the Sudanese archers, the Berber cavalry, the Turkic mercenaries, lay dead in the streets or scattered across the Judean hills. He died in the wide land, the shame of a Fatimid house whose stewardship of the Valley of Vision had ended in massacre and flight. In December 1917, the Ottoman High Command was whirled away toward Jericho and beyond, into the vast Anatolian heartland that was already beginning to fracture under the pressures of a world war and the emergence of Turkish nationalism. Their splendid chariots, the German motor corps, the heavy artillery, the telegraph systems they had installed, were left behind or abandoned in the retreat. The 400-year Ottoman station was pulled down in a single night, and the men who had occupied it found themselves rolling into a wide land that would become, within a few years, an entirely different country than the empire they had served.
And it shall come to pass in that day, that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and strengthen him with your sash, and I will hand over your authority to him. He will be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah.
After the violent hurling of Shebna, the prophecy breathes, the velocity of judgment slows, and a new figure steps into the space that has been cleared. Eliakim. The name itself is the prophecy. God will establish, not the administrator, not the steward, not the man who carves his own tomb. God will establish. Notice the contrast in the verbs. Shebna carved, he cut, he hewed, he forced his presence into the stone through his own effort. Eliakim is called. He is clothed by another hand. He is given authority rather than seizing it. The entire posture is different, not the reaching upward of human ego trying to establish itself in the geology of the city, but the receiving downward of someone who understands that the authority was never his to begin with. And then the most important title in the verse. He will be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Not a steward, not a manager, not an administrator, a father. The distinction Shebna and Eliakim represent is ultimately the distinction between a stepfather and a father. A stepfather manages the house. He administers the assets. He maintains the infrastructure and accounts for the expenditures. But his connection to the children is functional rather than biological, transactional rather than essential. When the house is threatened, his first calculation is his own survival. A father cannot make that calculation. The children are not assets he manages. They are extensions of himself. Their survival is not separate from his survival. Their future is not a line item in his ledger. It is the very thing his existence is for. Every imperial administration that has governed Jerusalem has been, in this sense, a stepfather. The Fatimids managed Jerusalem for the Cairo Caliphate. The Crusaders administered it for Rome and the feudal system of Western Europe. The Ottomans incorporated it into a vast imperial machine. The British held it under a League of Nations mandate. Each brought genuine competence. Each brought real investment in the city's infrastructure. And each, at the moment of crisis, revealed that their deepest loyalty was to themselves and to the distant empire that had placed them there. Godfrey of Bouillon, when he entered Jerusalem in 1099 and was offered the title of king, refused. He would not wear a crown of gold in the city where another had worn thorns. He took instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, the servant of the transition. For a brief moment, in that refusal of the crown, the Eliakim pattern appeared, a man clothed in authority that was not his own, serving a purpose larger than his personal legacy. And on December 11th, 1917, General Allenby approached the Jaffa Gate on foot. He had specifically ordered his staff to dismount before entering the city. The Kaiser had entered Jerusalem on horseback through a specially breached wall in 1898, the ultimate Shebna gesture, forcing the city's stone to accommodate his entrance. Allenby's entrance on foot surrounded by representatives of the French, Italian, American, and Arab forces rather than only British soldiers, was a conscious act of servant leadership. He read a proclamation guaranteeing the protection of every holy site of every religion. He acted for that morning as a father to the inhabitants rather than a conqueror of the territory. It was the last Eliakim moment in the ancient cycle, and it lasted for 30 years before the nail was removed.
I will place the key of the house of David on his shoulder, so he shall open, and no one shall shut, and he shall shut, and no one shall open.
The key placed on the shoulder is not a metaphor for administrative authority. It is a weight. In the ancient world, keys to palace gates were large bronze bars carried over the shoulder because they were too heavy to hold in the hand. The image is deliberate. The authority of the House of David is not a title or a credential. It is a burden carried on the body. And the absolute nature of the opening and shutting, no one shall shut what he opens, no one shall open what he shuts, describes something that goes beyond any human administration. This is the key to the destiny of the city itself, the ability to open gates of possibility that no human power can close, and to close doors of the past that no human nostalgia can reopen. When Godfrey of Bouillon accepted the protection of the Holy Sepulchre, the key of the city was symbolically placed on his shoulders. The gate that had been shut to the Latin world for centuries was opened. And for nearly a century, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem held that key, imperfectly, violently, with all the contradictions of a Crusader administration, until the key was taken from them at the horns of Hattin. When Allenby accepted the keys of Jerusalem on that December morning in 1917, he was the latest in the long line of Eliakim figures receiving a key that never truly belonged to any of them. The gate of the modern era was opened. The Ottoman shutting of the city to the possibility of Jewish return was ended. And a 30-year window, the British Mandate period, was opened through which the ancient cycle would complete its final movement.
I will fasten him as a nail in a firm place, and he shall be for a glorious throne to his father's house.
Eliakim is a nail, fixed, load-bearing, structural. The city can hang its weight on him because he is fastened not by his own strength, but by the hand that drove him into the wall. In the ancient household, the peg in the wall held everything. The robes, the vessels, the tools of daily life, all of it hung on the nail. A nail in a firm place was the center around which the organized life of the house was structured. When it held, everything hung in order. When it pulled out of the wall, the entire household collapsed to the floor. The firm place is not a geographical location. It is a spiritual foundation. The nail holds because it is driven into something real, a wall built on the maker rather than on human ambition. Eliakim's authority is firm because it is rooted in the covenant, in the genuine connection between the leader and the city's deepest identity, rather than in the temporary alignment of political interests that always eventually realigns against you. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, under Godfrey and his early successors, functioned for a time as a nail in a firm place. It provided the stable center around which the various communities of the city organized their lives: the Hospitallers and the Templars, the Italian merchant communities, the Eastern Christian populations, the Jewish communities that gradually returned. All of them hung their legal existence and their daily security on the central authority of the throne. The British Mandate was the final nail. For 30 years, it provided the stable framework within which the decisive events of the modern cycle unfolded. The Balfour Declaration, the immigration waves, the institutional development of the Jewish community, the emergence of the infrastructure of a state, all of it happened while hanging on the British nail in the wall of international law.
They shall hang upon him all the glory of his father's house, the offspring and the issue, every small vessel, from the cups even to all the flagons.
Once the nail is driven in, everything hangs on it. And the verse is careful to include everything, not just the great vessels, the powerful institutions, the flagons of the high-ranking officials, but also the small cups, the minor administrators, the local functionaries, the ordinary families whose legal status and daily security depend on the stability of the central authority. This is the test of a genuine Eliakim administration. Shebna counted the houses to consume them. Eliakim carries the weight of the houses to protect them. The small cups matter as much as the flagons. The most insignificant resident of the city has a legitimate claim on the protection of the one who carries the key. The most concrete expression of this principle in the modern cycle was the British proclamation at the Jaffa Gate in 1917. Allenby's guarantee of protection for every holy site of every religion, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Druze, Samaritan, was the administrative attempt to hang every small cup and every flagon on the new nail. It was imperfect. It was contradicted repeatedly by subsequent British policy. But the proclamation itself was the recognition that the key on the shoulder carries the weight of everyone, not just the powerful.
In that day, says the Lord of hosts, the nail that was fastened in the firm place shall be removed, and be cut down, and fall, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for the Lord has spoken it.
And then the nail falls. Every imperial nail that has ever been driven into the wall of Jerusalem has eventually been removed. This is not a failure of the prophecy, it is part of the prophecy. The verse does not say, "This nail will stand forever." It says this nail will be removed, and the burden hanging on it will be cut off from the support it had come to depend on. The Crusader nail fell at the Horns of Hattin in 1187, when Saladin destroyed the kingdom's army in a single afternoon. The vessels that had hung on it, the knights, the merchants, the church, the military orders, shattered on the floor of the valley. The Latin kingdom limped along for another century in the coastal cities, but the nail that had held Jerusalem was gone. The British nail was removed on May 14th, 1948. Sir Alan Cunningham, the last British High Commissioner, sailed away from Haifa harbour as the sun set. The mandate was over. The nail was pulled from the wall, and the burden that had hung on it, the Jewish community of Palestine, the nascent institutions of a state, the entire accumulated momentum of the return, was cut off from the support of the great imperial structure and left to stand or fall on its own. This was the most dangerous moment in the entire cycle, and it was also, in the deepest reading of the prophecy, the necessary moment. Because what happened next had never happened before in the 2,000-year cycle of the Valley of Vision. For the first time in the entire sequence, from the Assyrian crisis through Babylon, through Persia, through Greece, through Rome, through Byzantium, through Islam, through the Crusaders, through the Mamluks, through the Ottomans, through the British. The burden that fell from the nail did not look for a new nail to hang on. It stood up. The Jewish community that had been hanging on the British nail did not wait for a new imperial Eliakim to arrive and provide a new firm place. When the British nail finally gave way on May 14, 1948, the ancient cycle did something unprecedented. It stopped. For 2 millennia, the Jewish people lived as the daughter of the people, the ones who remained while their rulers fled. Their survival had always been pinned to foreign pegs. They hung their hopes on the Fatimids, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and finally the British. Every time a new Eliakim arrived from a foreign power, they prayed for stability. and every time that nail was pulled from the wall, the vessels shattered on the valley floor. But 1948 marked the Great Awakening. As Sir Alan Cunningham sailed out of Haifa, the burden attached to that imperial nail was suddenly severed. Jerusalem was left without an imperial father for the first time in ages. The panic and trampling of verse 5 returned, but this time the response was different. The people didn't wait for a new stepfather to walk through the Jaffa Gate. Instead, they turned back to the Maker, described in verse 11. They traded the biology of dependence, clinging to the nail, for a vision of sovereignty. They defended the gates and occupied the heights not as subjects of a foreign crown, but as the rightful heirs to the house of David. By reclaiming this ancestral vision, they transformed the valley back into the mountain. Jerusalem is no longer a geopolitical pawn being tossed between empires like the ball in verse 18. It has returned to its foundation. Isaiah warns us that any leadership built on the physics of ego or the armor of the forest will eventually be discarded. But the vision that defines Jerusalem is eternal. The era of the stranger has ended. The era of the son has begun. This conclusion was built into the cycle from the start, a moment where the people would no longer cry out for a new nail, but would look to their Creator. It's a moment for the onlookers to stop watching the spectacle of history and descend into the internal silence where genuine vision lives.